What's up, TikTok? So, for those that don't know me, I am Pick the Pagan from YouTube, and I am a YouTuber. And I'm going to try to condense down in at least to 10 minutes my story of how I found Hellenic Polytheism. A long story, broke it down in 10 minutes. Let's see if I can do it. So, I have to start off by saying that I come from a very religious and spiritual background from 2 generations before me being in the ministry as a pastor, evangelist, or so forth. And so that played a huge role in my life because I was raised knowing that there was divinity and a God. So I went to high school, and all the way from birth to high school, I went to church on Sunday. Wednesday was involved in the youth groups and everything you think of when you think of church kid. But when I became a teenager, I kind of got disillusioned and bored with the idea of religion and spirituality, probably from the routine of having to go and doing my service Sundays, Wednesdays, reading the Bible, and so forth. And so I became spiritual but not religious. So in high school, when I was spiritual but not religious, I was more accepting to friends who had different spiritual paths. And that was the introduction to other spiritual paths such as Wicca and paganism. Instead of shunning them, I would ask them questions. Like they would wear a pinnacle ring, and I would ask, what does that mean? What is that? And so that would be the first steps into where I am now. Move 10 years later, I meet a girl who tells me on the second date that she's a witch, and that piques my curiosity. And so I go to the bookstore, and while I'm dating her, I find the book, Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner. I read it, and that really gets my curiosity even more flowing. Not that I'm a witch or a practicing pagan in that way, but what that book did for me is that it opened the door to make me think, wow, there is more to divinity than just a singular God. And my brain just about wanted to malfunction when I read that, because I was so brainwashed into monotheism and the church. That thought never even really crossed my mind. So my girlfriend and I broke up, but the spirituality stayed with me. I was learning about paganism and about the gods and so forth, or at least the Wiccan gods, because that's what I was at the time. And so I typed up on Witchfox looking for a coven. Remember when Witchfox was around for you old people like me? And I found a local coven that would accept me and take me in. So I went to this local coven that was called the Circle of Ravens. And Circle of Ravens was a very small, untraditional, loose, eclectic kind of group of pagans, but I learned a lot. And what was really interesting about it is that the head priestess was very good at tarot, like not just telling you vague things when you read the tarot, but she would know to the date when things would happen. And the story I want to tell is that one day I got tarot reading from her, and she was just really depressed. And I said, why, what's going on? She said, you're going to leave me by April. And I was like, I was so into this group that I was like, that's not going to happen. She's like, yeah. And then she was like depressed the rest of the day. And then it happened months later, but my wife and her got into an argument, which forced me to leave the group. It was in April. So that was weird. That was interesting. And so I leave that in coven. And then I find another about a year later called Willow Dragonstone. So I got into Willow, and I learned a lot. They were more formal, traditional, and really more like when you think of a real traditional coven, that was them. So I learned a ton from them. But it got to the point when I was in there, again, I found them on Witchfox, type, but I got kind of that old feeling of just no satisfaction, like this isn't where I want to be spiritually. It kind of came over me, because even when I was in these covens and with these witches, it wasn't the witchcraft that was appealing to me. It was the spiritual worship of the gods and the god and goddess. And so when it was focused on witchcraft, I just kind of lost interest, because it was the spiritual aspect that I was always interested in. And so after a few years, I left that group, and I kind of became an eclectic pagan that was spiritual, looking for a home. And I remembered that I always loved the Greek gods. I always had a fondness for the gods of Greece. And one day came that I walked into a Goodwill or a thrift store like that, and they were selling vases of Greek vases. And also they had vases that had grapevines painted on them. And that got my brain thinking about, why not look into worshiping the gods of Greece? Because I've always felt a connection to them. And so I went to Facebook, because Facebook was the big thing then, and I found groups, and I joined, started reading books, and without a long story into that, that's how I got to where I am. So that's how you go from being a Christian kid, reading the Bible every day, all the way to being a Hellenic polytheist. So that's my story with a lot of fluff cut out, but there's a lot more to it. If you're interested in hearing more about how I became a Hellenic polytheist and more details, that's like a 25-minute long video. You can check it out on my YouTube channel at Pick the Pagan. It's called How I Became a Hellenic Polytheist. Not too special with that title, but it is an interesting story that has a lot of more depth to it, where it tells some ghost stories and stuff and supernatural things that happened to me. So I tried to condense it down to 10 minutes, and I think I did pretty good to try to get under that TikTok time. Anyway, guys, I'll see you later.